And we're going to have a phone conversation now with Brendan Cunningham, a professor in the economics and finance department here at Eastern. He's been in the family here for 5 years. So, Brendan, first of all, welcome aboard, and thanks for joining us today on the radio.
Hi, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to join you.
Now, the reason why we're chatting with Brendan today is that a piece was published in the Connecticut Mirror on the 16th, I believe, and it had to do with state funding for higher education. And this is an area that Brendan has kind of researched and worked for years in the areas of economics and higher education. And with everything going on with the virus today, everything's out of normal. And we're looking at new ways to look at the old situation of budget priorities and where money goes. And this is kind of the basis that drew me to your piece, was looking at the amount of money that goes from public coffers to private colleges and institutions was eye-opening when you realize how much that is and what the norms are about that. So maybe I'm going to get out of the way for a second, Brendan, and let you start off by just explaining what led you today to share a piece at this time in particular about state use of funds for higher ed and how we're going to get through the crisis in a better way.
Sure. I'm happy to chat about that a little bit. So, as is often the case with research projects, I was looking at records dealing with a slightly different topic, mostly having to do with borrowing by public universities in Connecticut. And I was kind of deep in the records of bonds that had been floated to fund infrastructure for the state university campuses as well as UConn.
Right.
And all of a sudden I stumbled upon this bond that the state of Connecticut had issued with Yale University's name on it. And I said to myself, that's really something I didn't expect to see, that the state of Connecticut would be borrowing for a private institution like Yale. They're very affluent university. They've got the fourth largest endowment, or tied for the fourth largest endowment in higher education. And so that led me to kind of I basically pulled that thread to try to understand a little bit more about, where that borrowing comes from and why it's there.
Well, it's interesting what gets covered in the news. And when you get into budget debates, the pressure's high. People need tangible outcomes, right? Things just can't stay the same. And when they look at where support can be found, some areas don't always get explored as much as others, right? And I wondered if this is an area you think that bears further exploration due to the pressures right now that require thinking outside the normal box.
Yes, absolutely. So, I think we all kind of understand that finances in all different sorts of contexts are sort of challenging right now and following a very different course than what we might expect to see under normal circumstances. And that's true for higher education across the country and also in our state. So, the state government is, looking for ways to sort of balance its books. There's a lot of different ways to do that. It looks like one approach that's been adopted is to kind of curtail or shrink the funding for the state universities. But I think it's very important that when we start asking about sort of sacrifice in these kinds of settings, we start with the question of who should be sacrificing and also what is the entire picture when it comes to public support for higher education. And when I pulled that thread of sort of bond borrowing on behalf of private education in our state, what I found was that that's a multi-million-dollar sort of subsidy to private schools. And so I guess I'm asking the question of whether we're not looking at shared sacrifice across the entire higher education industry, as a first step towards trying to balance the books.
I really appreciated your piece when I read it because it helped me reframe the existing arguments I'm aware of about how to fund education. And I want to quote a piece from your article. Again, this is from the Connecticut Mirror, November 16. Yale is not alone. Connecticut has outstanding borrowing totaling $7.8 billion on behalf of 8 private higher educational institutions, including Yale, as we mentioned, Wesleyan, Fairfield University, Connecticut College, and others. There's another $1.8 billion in state borrowing on behalf of private secondary schools with famous names, high-profile names: Choate Rosemary Hall, Loomis Chaffee, Miss Porter's, Ethel Walker, Avon Old Farms, Hotchkiss, Kingswood, Oxford, and the Greenwich Academy. So it totals about $10 billion in public borrowing on behalf of private education. Do these institutions get any tax benefits when the state borrows on their behalf?
Yeah, I would say that's exactly why these institutions choose to raise funds via the state through this authority called the Connecticut Health and Education Authority, So basically, it's a whole additional step towards borrowing that they're taking, precisely because it allows the people that are lending to them to sort of not have to pay federal taxes on the proceeds from the loan. And what that means is that when they go out to borrow, they borrow at a lower interest rate. So the whole reason this additional step is taken to involve the state in their borrowing process is so that they can basically borrow at a lower interest rate. And that's basically the sort of subsidy or benefit that the state is extending to these private educational institutions.
And I noticed that many of them are very proud, and they promote the fact that a large number of their students are from out of state, which means that resident students don't necessarily benefit from the use of those state funds. Is that a fair analogy, or am I stretching it too far?
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. Now that will vary from private institution to private institution.
Sure.
Certainly maybe some of the secondary education institutions might have a local base for their student populations. But yeah, certainly the kind of colleges and universities, they draw from, both across the United States as well as around the world. And so here we are, Connecticut, sort of supporting educational efforts for families across the country and around the globe with this system that we've set up. Well, in the meantime, the CSU system, which, is heavily focused upon students and families here in Connecticut,
that's right,
they're seeing their budgets being cut and squeezed. And, someone might argue that, of course, these are employers in our state, sort of like a football team. And the analogous thing we see in sports is, states providing subsidies for football teams to open stadiums and that sort of thing. But at least when it comes to those stadiums, the people who live in the state get to go see the game. But here in Connecticut, you've got, students coming from all around the world, and we're supporting their institutions. And, generally speaking, I'm in favor of that kind of thing. But again, if we're going to start from asking the question of sort of shrinking support for higher education, I think the next question we have to ask is, are we doing that fairly, particularly for the families who live here in Connecticut?
I can imagine in earlier times when the budgeting was not under such stress in so many ways that there were really good reasons why some of these things were set up, or else they wouldn't have been approved, obviously. But the thinking that produced them may need a new look for the future to say, well, that might have been viable then, but kind of a fresh look at the equation in a non-threatening, non-political way. That's the problem today, is there's very little safe space for people to really put out ideas that might get hot without generating a lot of heat immediately, right? That's part of the trouble for the public to get a handle on this, I think. Seems to be a lot of emphasis on the heat and not a quiet discussion without people getting personal. You know what I mean?
Yes.
Because it is personal.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean,
it is.
Education is a very, very personal sort of endeavor, and it's extremely important for our society. And as a first principle, I'm personally in support of as much support for educational activity by, in all kinds of institutions and all different kinds of students. But when we get into questions of fairness and equity and trade-offs between, who is getting which support, and is that the kind of support we need to establish so that there's robust opportunity for all students as they learn and graduate from institutions, that becomes a far more challenging question.
By the way, I want to mention, in case you've just joined us, we're having a conversation today with Brendan Cunningham, who is a professor in the Department of Economics and Finance here at Eastern, about a piece he wrote on the 16th of November in the Connecticut Mirror. It's called "There is Too Much State Borrowing to Benefit Private Colleges and Schools." And you mentioned the Board of Regents and the CSU budget. This interview that we're doing today, Brendan, is part of an occasional series I'm doing to give people a chance to reach out and share thoughts and information. And I had the president of the Eastern chapter of AAUP on, Nicole Crassus, recently. And we're going to be tracking this issue in the weeks ahead, all through the winter, actually, with different people. And I appreciate you being part of this dialogue today, because one of the issues that you know that is very hot here is the recommendation of an $8 million cut in funding for adjunct faculty and UAs and part-time staff. And these are employees who only get paid without benefits. They have no other expenses except their employee costs, so to speak. And I wondered if you've heard any feedback from other peers about this particular proposal or the impact it might have, since it's a small piece of a much bigger pie that you just pointed to. Are there ways that people are thinking about leveraging this money differently?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And, I think that personally, the sort of the top priority for educational institutions should be to educate. And when you have educators like temporary and part-time faculty in the classroom doing that, it's my view that that's the last place you should look to sort of economize or reduce support, because that, at the end of the day, is what these institutions are all about. Having the faculty member in the classroom, being an effective teacher, also engaging in scholarship so that they're current in their field and, bringing students along for them in that scholarly enterprise. So my own personal view is that you should exhaust all options before seeking to kind of reduce funding for faculty and teaching in the classroom. Unfortunately, I'm not sure that has happened. There seems to be a sort of an urgency with respect to how quickly these changes were made. They were not shared with faculty and staff across the CSU campuses before they were implemented.
Yes,
and I
true.
do understand the sense of urgency that people have given the circumstances. But the other piece of the puzzle is that our state has, a $3 billion rainy day fund, which is essentially a pile of cash meant to deal with these complicated situations. And when that is the other piece of the puzzle, it's a little harder to understand the haste with which these things are happening.
Yes, it is, because the pressure is high. But, it's interesting. There is a quote somebody attributed to you. I think you sent a note. It's about Animal Farm from Orwell. It says, "On Animal Farm, all hiring freezes are equal, but some hiring freezes are more equal than others." I love that line. Somehow that fit.
Thank you, yeah.
Somehow that fit. But I just want to mention one thing for full disclosure, to be fair, and I always do this whenever I have an interview. I've been here as an adjunct at Eastern since 1984, so people need to know how much I love this place in terms of why I've stayed so long. But I'm always as a part-time employee teaching media courses. For the full-timers, it's a different place and a different situation. But as you look at practices, one thing you mentioned, maybe I could give you a last question for today. After all the research now, you're focusing more on specific policy options and practices. As you've kind of focused your research in this area, are there any practices that you've seen that have worked elsewhere that might bear a look that we could consider in Connecticut as we try to wind our way through this maze?
That's a great question. And I think that, there's a possibility that the challenges we face right now will be addressed with sort of larger implementation of larger policies at the federal level regarding sort of free public education, higher education, or reduced tuition that gives people more access to study at universities like ours, and that will go a long way towards bringing more students onto campuses,
Right.
And it sort of addressing these kinds of financial issues that are popping up. We will get out of the current recession. I think that's the other part of things, that we just kind of need to bide our time until the tide sort of turns around and everything is back on track economy-wise. So I do think we're in a temporary circumstance, and the key thing is to not allow temporary circumstances to dictate long-term outcomes, neither for our students nor for our campuses. And so that's kind of the philosophy I take when it comes to these things.
Well, that's a really good note to close this conversation with, too, Brendan, because we're trying to find positive approaches to get through this without people kind of giving up or getting too into the old modalities of conflict. That's not going to help anything, even though people have very strong feelings. And I appreciate your openness and the peace and willingness to share your thoughts, and I hope this will encourage others to do the same. Because one thing I'm trying to do in a positive way is offer that safe space where these interviews are recorded, they're posted, links are shared, so people can participate. And I've done outreach to the Board of Regents to try to get someone from their press office to share thoughts about their proposal for the budget cuts. And I will reach out to other people as well at higher levels if they'll participate. But I'm trying to reach locally here on campus and in the state level, people that are the most affected, that often don't get the microphones. And that's why I'm glad to have some time with you today, Brendan Cunningham. Thank you so much.
Thank you, John. Thanks so much for having me.
Look forward to having you back again sometime when the timing is good, and I wish you well and a great Thanksgiving ahead.
All right, you too. Yeah, and my best wishes to you and yours.
Thank you, Brendan. Take care.